Anybody with even a passing knowledge of writing will know that one of the most important aspects to a story is to have the audience feel about the characters exactly the way the writer wants them to. Because if they don't, then that's one of the simplest ways for a story to fail. And as I've stressed in many other videos, it is very important that the sympathetic characters come across as sympathetic, and the unsympathetic characters come across as unsympathetic. And oftentimes a writer will try to achieve this by making the sympathetic characters likable and the unsympathetic characters unlikable. Now, obviously, there are a lot of variations on that, but the point is that pretty much any writing expert, which I'll freely admit I'm not, will say that it's important to have at least one likable character in a story. Otherwise, the audience might just lose interest in it completely because they have nobody to root for. And yet, famed director Quentin Tarantino arguably succeeded in doing just that, which is to say, he managed to write a movie with an entire cast full of seemingly unlikable characters and still get the audience to care about what happens. And today, I'd like to go over how exactly he managed to do that. And obviously there will be spoilers for the movie in question ahead, so in case you don't want to know what happens, you should probably be on the lookout. You have been warned. Alright, so when it comes to Quentin Tarantino, having a cast of unconventionally likable characters is really nothing new for him. Such movies as Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, From Dusk Till Dawn, Jackie Brown, and Kill Bill all mainly center around criminals and other people who either do or have done some pretty morally questionable things. But the difference here is that all of these movies have at least one or two characters that you can most definitely call the good guy, or at least find likable enough to root for. My point is, there is at least one character that the audience can gravitate towards. And what also helps is his penchant for telling stories in non-linear order, so until a definitive good guy is revealed, the audience will still be invested if only to figure out what's going on. But only in his later movies, such as Inglourious, Django Unchained, or Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, did he start telling more conventionally black and white based stories, with the distinction between the good guys and the bad guys, and therefore who is and isn't likable, being obvious very early on, which also coincides with his telling stories in a more linear fashion. But then we get to the movie of his which doesn't appear to have any likable characters in it at all. And not only does he not hide it, he puts it right in the title. The Hateful Eight. Now, while considered one of Tarantino's lesser efforts, it's still considered a pretty good movie, especially for a decade that struggled heavily with original content. And as I said before, what makes this movie particularly notable is that Quentin Tarantino manages to pull off the seemingly impossible task of taking a bunch of unlikable characters and telling a story with them that manages to keep the audience interested in what's going on the whole time. Now I would just like to clarify that writing a movie without any conventionally likable characters isn't impossible to do. Because as I touched on in my video, the comedy classic that almost wasn't, which you can find a link in the description to, it is possible to get an audience invested in characters that don't always seem like the best people. But the difference here is, Tarantino is telling everybody right off the bat that the 8 main characters are downright hateful. which might then lead one to wonder, why should we care about them? And Tarantino manages to answer that question in a very effective fashion. Because here's the thing, when people go into movies, there's usually either one of two mentalities they'll have when it comes to the characters, which is either give me a reason to care about the characters, or give me a reason not to care about the characters. Now, for those in the first camp, the tricks Tarantino pulls might not work so well, but for people in the second camp, his methods are almost perfect. To put it simply, how much a given person will like this movie depends entirely on if they go into movies liking all the characters at first, or if they go in looking for a reason to care about them. Because again, those who are willing to give the characters a chance are going to find a lot more enjoyment in the story Tarantino tells than those actively looking for likable and unlikable characters. But to get into the movie itself, the point is that we've got 8 characters, though it actually turns out to be 10, and none of them are great people. We've got a bounty hunter who likes to see his targets hang and isn't afraid to be rough with them, an extremely ruthless, cynical bounty hunter jaded by discrimination and the Civil War, an openly bigoted man whose father was responsible for quite a few atrocities in the same war, a bigoted former general responsible for just as many war crimes, an absolutely psychotic criminal whose behavior alone tells you why she's worth so much money, and 3 members of her gang so violent they make the aforementioned bounty hunter look like Colonel Sanders by comparison. And for the other 2, characters that don't appear in the title, we have Jody, the leader of that aforementioned violent gang, and the stagecoach driver, who's mostly just there and likable simply by virtue of the fact that he's not nearly as bad as everybody else. So one might think, with a cast like that, it would probably be better off if everyone died. And they pretty much do, funnily enough. But Tarantino pulls out all the stops to make sure that the audience feels something more than satisfaction by the time that ending comes. Because at first, Tarantino uses a trick from his non-linear works and has the characters that will later become the good guys have an almost 40-minute conversation, and due to Tarantino being a master of dialogue, it's able to keep the audience interested all right. And what also helps is that not all of the characters are downright hateable. And the best example of this would be John Ruth. Because while he likes to bring his bounties to the hangman alive and is rough with Daisy, the thing is, it's established pretty quickly that Daisy honestly deserves what he throws at her, and his bringing his bounties in alive has to do with a complex philosophy he has, rather than out of anything malicious or sadistic in nature. And also, what's made particular note of is that despite the era, he's actually shown to be very accepting of other races, openly treating Warren as an equal and showing disdain to all the talk of the Confederate cause, clearly believing racism to be stupid. So the point is, it makes the audience at least somewhat sympathize with him, especially with Kurt Russell giving an extremely cool old guy edge to him. And even Warren can also come across as a bit likable for similar reasons until he starts showing his extremely nasty side later on. But the point is, by the time they get to the cabin, the audience can sympathize to at least some degree with Ruth and Warren. And this is only compounded by Ruth saying that he's pretty sure somebody might try to kill him to rescue Daisy, which also helps add a level of intrigue to keep the audience guessing as to what will happen. Then at about the 2-hour mark, Ruth and OB, pretty much the only two likable characters left at that point, die from poisoning. So what is there left to keep the audience caring? Well, at first there's simply the matter of who the killer is. Because at that point, that's something the audience will definitely want to know. Who is the one that's trying to rescue Daisy? And then the viewer is really thrown a curveball when another man is revealed to be hiding under the floor and all heck breaks loose. Then, in true Tarantino fashion, the movie then goes backwards and reveals how everything got to that point, and in the process shows just how horrible Jody's gang really is. And because of that, by the time it cuts back to the present, you just want to see if Warren and Mannix can stop them or not, and overall finally find out what the outcome will be. Now you might be thinking, but Warren is a huge jerk, to put it mildly, and Mannix is a proud bigot. So why should the audience want to see them succeed? Well, for one very simple reason. Because they're against Jody's gang. Think about it. Tarantino just dedicated 20 minutes to the four of these guys murdering a bunch of completely innocent people and taking plenty of time to dwell on just how innocent and undeserving of their fate they really are. And all of this only gives you just an idea of all the other things they have done, including what on earth Daisy could have $10,000 on her head for. While in the case of Warren, the story he tells to Smithers could be a complete fabrication, and all of his other crimes are only talked about and never shown. And the same goes for Mannix. We only ever see him trying to be a proper lawman. The worst thing he's shown doing is being a jerk to Warren. And what's important to remember is, it's what the audience sees the characters do that leaves the biggest impression on them. You can say a character did something all you want to, but it's what the audience actually sees them doing that's going to have the most influence on how they feel about them. And because the viewer gets to see the sheer brutality of Jody's gang on full display, while Warren and Mannix haven't done anything nearly as bad on screen, again, apart from Warren's ambiguous story to Smithers, but he's got the benefit of doubt on his side, it makes the audience automatically want to root for them simply because Jody's gang is that horrible and they can actually do something to stop them. And in the end, they both managed to do just that, even honoring John Ruth by hanging Daisy just as he intended to, and Mannix realizing that maybe he was wrong to feel about certain people the way he did. And because of all of this context, the movie is able to end on a more bittersweet note than a triumphant one. Because while Jody's gang has been completely wiped out, a lot of characters that arguably didn't deserve to be killed also ended up dying too. So in the end, through a combination of dialogue, intrigue, mystery, and making certain characters just likable enough, even if it's only in comparison to other characters, Quentin Tarantino managed to take a concept that at first glance seemed doomed to fail and actually turned it into something that never fails to keep the audience's interest. Especially because while the title does imply that all 8 characters are unlikable, or hateful as it were, that doesn't mean that all of them are so bad that the audience wouldn't like them, even to a small degree. And Tarantino takes full advantage of that, especially for the character of John Ruth. And also that the title does tip off the viewer to the fact that the characters might not be all that conventionally likable in the first place. That definitely helps too. But that being said, I'm pretty sure only somebody like Quentin Tarantino could have taken such a concept and actually make it work, because he has a lot of experience in telling stories with a ton of morally questionable characters, and not to mention has the benefit of his well-known dialogue. But the point still remains that as long as the right person is behind it, a story can indeed be told with very few, or even arguably no, likable characters in it and still manage to keep the audience interested the entire time, as the Hateful Eight definitely shows. Because while it isn't for everyone, it was still way too critically acclaimed for anybody to argue that it didn't succeed in what it was trying to do. Now once again, I'm not saying that this is a formula that should be copied too often, especially because as a writer myself, I will freely admit that the more likable characters a story has, the better off it will be. If you're interested, you can even check out my video on how best to do prison movies, which you can also find a link in the description to, where I get into that topic in more detail. But the point is that Quentin Tarantino pretty much pulled off the impossible and proved with The Hateful Eight that it can actually be done regardless. Alright, I think I've made my point with all of this. So now I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you believe that Quentin Tarantino pulled off something truly impressive with The Hateful Eight in regards to how he handles the likability of his characters? Or do you believe I'm wrong and that the movie isn't all that good for that exact reason? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And like I just said, you don't have to agree with this video if you don't want to. You are entitled to your own opinion, and if you think I've got everything backwards, that's absolutely fine. And thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it. And I hope to see you all next time.